My name is Freya Mowat. I'm an associate professor at the university. I do ophthalmology as a career, so I teach and treat animals with eye diseases. I see mostly cats and dogs and horses, so be mindful of that when you ask me questions about birds, because I may not know the answer. I've learned a lot during researching this presentation. I did a lot of homework for this, so thank you for letting me learn about this subject. All right, so I am a bit of a bird enthusiast. I keep 3 birds in my backyard. I live on the east side of Madison. So this is Davina. When she was teeny tiny, all my birds are named after famous rock stars. So she was thought to be a rooster, so she was David Bowie, but she had really cute eyes. But she's actually a female and lays eggs for me, so she's now Davina. I also have had the privilege of working with some raptors. When I was a resident at Michigan State, there was a raptor center right nearby, and I got the opportunity to work with a number of raptors. And this is a little screech owl that came to us with a cataract and some inflammation inside its left eye, and we got to treat it for disease. So that was a part of my career I really enjoy. So as I was starting to research this, I wanted one of those quotes that you put at the beginning of a talk, right? So we always do this. So I came up with this one that actually had been originally said in 1950 by this person, André Rochon d'Aubignon. And he said a bird is a wing guided by an eye. And the person, Graham Martin, who I will cite many, many times during this presentation, who was an amazing biologist of eyes in birds, changed it. He said, no, it's a bill. So I'll leave that question up to you in terms of whether bills or wings are more important from a visual standpoint. So I'm going to give you a quick primer on eyeballs. You've had a little bit already in the first talk, so I don't have to tell you about the cornea, but I will tell you why the cornea matters. So the cornea is actually more important in bending light than the lens inside the eye. So if you think about the eye like a camera, the cornea and the lens are both lenses within your eyeball. And I like to think of the analogy of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon here. You've all seen this image, right? You've seen a light ray hit a solid surface and then get bent. That is exactly what the cornea does, because there's air and then there's water inside your eyeball. And so light bends a lot more at your cornea than it actually does at your lens. So bear that in mind when you look at some of the changes that bird eyes have done, because there's 10,000 species of birds. So there's a ton of different variants in how birds have evolved into their ecological niches. The other thing I want to point out is the iris, which, if you are camera enthusiasts, is the aperture in your camera. So essentially what that does is it changes the amount of light that the back of the eye gets. So if you have a wide aperture, you're gathering a lot of light. So if you live in a low light environment, that gives you lots of opportunity for light at the expense of blurriness, right? Because there's a lot of scatter that happens inside the eye. So if you live in a bright light environment, you can constrict your pupil, and that makes the rays of light more parallel inside the eyes and more perfectly optically aligned, and gives you more perfect vision. So eyes that have a lot of pupil movement tend to be the ones that have the better vision, if you look at like wildlife in general. And the whole point of all of this stuff at the beginning of the eyeball is to optimize and mediate the light that hits the eyeball, because essentially that's what an eye does, is it transfers light to information. So as I mentioned, lots of different variation. Think about 11,000 species of birds. We've actually only studied the eyes of a very small number of species. So if you ask me about your favorite species in the Q&A, please don't expect me to know, because nobody probably does. So there's some kind of major classification systems that people have used for eyeballs. So this is the eyeball I've just shown you. This is a rock dove. And its eye is sitting on the side of its head, and it has this kind of classic, slightly kind of tubular kind of appearance, or like flat kind of appearance, and its eye is typically quite small. Something to be aware of, though, is there is 5 times variance in size of eye between different species of birds, which means that we can have a bird eye that's somewhere in the sort of 5 millimeter range all the way up to 5 centimeters, so really 2 or 3 centimeters. Very, very large variance. So this is what I've just shown you, and we've got quite a wide field of view, and we'll talk about field of view in a bit. And then you've got your aquatic birds, and these animals, as we talked about with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, no longer have that air-water interface. So they now have a water-water interface, so they can't bend the light. So they just kind of de-evolved their corneas a bit. They flattened them out, and they've made the lens a bit fatter because that's what has to do all the work at bending light. Their eyes are also sometimes quite small, so the size of the eye doesn't really dictate their behavior. And again, their visual field is quite wide because their eyes are situated on the side of the head. And then you've got your nocturnal raptors who did things a little bit differently. One thing I will say is the nocturnal raptors actually use hearing just as much as they use vision to localize their prey. But their eyeballs are, and this is not to scale, in fact even this is not to scale, their eyeballs are ginormous. So if you look at this scale here, 8 millimeters, tawny owl has a 17 millimeter length eyeball. So, and that's just the focal point of the eye from the middle of the lens to the back. So they have prioritized this high real estate of the head to put a lot of focus on gathering light to detect photons of light. So, you know, interpret that as you will. They still use vision a lot, even though they use hearing as well. And they have very frontal-facing eyeballs. And we will touch on this a little bit as we go along, but we have a sort of expense of a narrow field of view because of that. Fun fact, we're going to have a few of these as we go along. So ostrich eyes are actually bigger than their brains. So we just talked about how tawny owls have really big eyes, but actually ostrich eyes win the prize. This is a picture courtesy of Dr. de Bilzig. And their focal length is 21.8 millimeters. So they literally have given their entire head away to eyeballs. What I will say is most birds have done the same thing in slightly less extreme ways. So most birds, their head weight relative to eyes, there's 15% of their head is eyeball, whereas most mammals have 1% of their head is eyeball. So there is a lot of focus on vision in most species of bird. Their eye size is typically at the expense of other things. So what you can see in most birds is a lack of other stuff around the eyeball, like muscles. So they actually don't move, many birds don't move their eyes around, they move their heads around instead. So just be aware of that. Some raptors can move their eyes, but most birds have kind of de-evolved eye muscles. So Graham Martin, who I mentioned at the beginning, has kind of helped me out here and given me 4 things to talk about. So 4 ways that human and bird vision differ. Color is a big one. Acuity, so the ability to see clearly and crisply. Depth and distance, and we'll talk very briefly about that because we could probably do a whole 40-minute talk just on that alone. And then field of view, which again I just touched on briefly as well. So we'll talk first about color, and again, an inspirational quote. Color is not a property of the physical world, but a construct of the visual system that analyzes it. So think about that when you look at your person next to you, that actually your perception of color and what you're seeing right now in this image is totally different, not completely different, but similar, but a little bit different to your partner. If you have a family member who has some color variance, right? Males are more susceptible to dichromatic, so 2-color vision instead of 3-color vision, who are colorblind. That is all part of our existence on Earth, and all species have a slightly different variance. So birds are no exception to this. So here's our vision. It's a little, we're doing this from an anthropomorphic perspective. So take again into perspective what we think might be happening may not actually be what the animal perceives, but this is what we see on an average kind of view. So this is a picture of a flower, and we have 3 different colors that we can perceive, which make up the rainbow that we can see. So we have a blue colored cone, so these are the photoreceptors that mediate color vision, cone photoreceptors. We have a blue colored cone, we have a green colored cone, and we have a blue colored cone, which is how you get those rainbow colors. Birds, on the other hand, have 4 different types of cone. So they have a violet colored cone, which in many bird species, not all, but many, is an ultraviolet cone. So now, if you actually look at this flower under ultraviolet light, you see that there's a landing pad. And this is probably more adapted for insect species than birds. But there is some evidence, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, that this is used by birds as a way to navigate and do things. So it's important to note, though, that not all birds have UV vision. So, for example, owls do not have UV vision. It makes no sense because they do most of their work at night. So why does it matter? And again, there's a lot of popular hypotheses, but there aren't that many true, confident facts. So one of the biggest confident facts is foraging. So birds, for the most part, are eating UV reflective stuff like seeds and berries and insects. Whereas the stuff that surrounds those things are absorbing UV light, which is leaves, right? Leaves are intended to absorb UV light so that they can photosynthesize. So if you think about popping your prey or your foraging material out from the background of the leaves, UV vision does that really, really well. So that's one very well-proven hypothesis or idea. The other thing, going all the way back to Darwin, is the idea that sexual signaling or mating behaviors are driven by color. And so they've done some neat experiments with some blue-throated birds where they put sunscreen on the birds and showed that they lost their ability to do their displays and have them be successful. So some amazing scientists have done work to really prove that sexual behavior and mating behavior is driven by, at least partly, by UV light. The other thing to bear in mind is that birds that look black to us may actually reflect UV light in a really beautiful way. So think about those black birds and maybe not assume that they're boring, because the other birds might not think so. And then the one that's a little bit more controversial is the concept that birds may use large gradients of UV light in the sky over time to orient themselves, so perhaps using that kind of signal for migratory patterns and things like that. So definitely more controversial, but certainly possible. The other thing that bird color vision does is it creates tuning of the light. So I use the analogy of rose-colored spectacles or rose-tinted spectacles. I don't know what the metaphor is here in the US. But essentially what they are doing in their retinas is tuning the light even more than we can assume by having 4 different colors of perception. So what they have, this is the retina, so another histology picture, sorry. This is the retina, and this right here, these bottom pieces here, are where photoreception happens, so where the camera lens, the camera film or whatever is present in the eye. And what you can see is right above that is a tiny little blob of oil. And in most photoreceptors, not all, but some photoreceptors, there is this blob of oil. The function of this blob of oil is multifactorial. So it's thought to be a little tiny lens, so that it's actually channeling light perfectly to where it needs to be, so the optics of the eye are optimized. But also, if you can see on the image on the right, there's a number of colors that these little light blobs have, these oiled blobs have, and they go all the way from clear or transparent all the way up to quite dark red, like you can see here. And these are all pigments derived from plants and algae that the bird has created. So there's certainly some behavioral evidence that they are actually tuning light within certain cells to create perhaps even more of a spectrum of color than we would imagine based on having 4 color perceptions. So I'll leave you with some pondering on what birds actually see in terms of color. So we're going to skip along, and I would love to go deeper into all of these subjects, but I just don't have time. So we're going to go along into acuity. So here we're going to talk a lot about the raptors. So we'll sort of tune out the others for a bit, and we'll just talk here about these middle ground birds, the passerine raptors and diurnal birds, and we'll talk mostly about raptors here. So when we talk about acuity, I have to explain a little bit of concept here. So here's a primate, a human, and we have very frontal-facing eyeballs, and our world is in front of us, and we have to do a lot of fine motor skills with our hands. So we need binocular depth perception, and the way that you do that is with 2 eyes, and you can process information from one eye and the other eye, and you can tell where things are in space by doing that. So we prioritized, because we're doing all these things with our hands, we prioritized frontal vision, and we prioritized binocular vision, where we have 2 eyes converging on a subject so that the carrot here can be grasped, held, turned, moved in front of our face. There's all these other parts of our vision, the binocular fields, which are outside of that binocular field. So essentially there's bits where we can sort of orient our head once we've seen something, but our entire existence is focused on trying to get something into our binocular field. That is in contrast to most other species. So this is a bunny, just because that's the picture I could find. But essentially a bunny has a different purpose in life, right? It's existing and it has to stay alive. So what it has done over many evolutionary generations, it has created a small binocular field in front of it, and then it's got a really, really wide field of view And it's got a tiny binocular field behind it as well, because what's going to happen is something's going to run up behind you and eat you. So it has created essentially a sort of mohawk of binocularity all the way above its head, instead of us, where we only have this sort of like circle of binocularity in front of us. So kind of cool. Birds have another problem. They have a bill. Right, and the bill, if you think about putting a road cone in front of your face, is really in the way. And it's functional, right? It does all of these amazing things. But how are you going to use binocular vision if you have a bill in front of your face? So what the eyes have done is adapted to that thing in the way and created this sort of distance of binocularity, so it's right in front of that bill. And so most birds have binocular vision that encompasses the bill, but the bill gets in the way. And we'll talk about that when we talk about field of view in just a few slides. So here we're going to talk about raptors, because raptors have really become the master of vision. They're hunting on the wing for things that are also flying around, right? So they have made their fighter pilot skills optimized. So what evolution has done is prioritize the size of the eye relative to the size of the body in raptors. So everything that isn't blue is a raptor. So what you can see is that in this graph, which is size of body against size of eyeball, is that raptors, for their size, have exceptionally large eyeballs. So they have prioritized all that visual information over other things that encompass their head. And obviously their brain is processing all that information as well. So I like to bring it all back to us, because we know that's who's in the audience. So you go to the optometrist, right, and you get your eyes checked, and you read these letters off the screen, and they tell you how good your vision is. So normal vision in humans is somewhere in this range. So if you're really, really good, you might end up being a fighter pilot and you have really excellent acuity vision, but the average human sits within this line of green and blue. If you are a wedge-tailed eagle, on the other hand, which has the highest visual acuity of birds anywhere, you have a visual acuity that is 5 times or more better than us. So truly amazing. And I kind of want to make it sort of equivalent. So this is an E that is sitting in front of a bird and a human. And we're at 20 feet, right? So the bird is seeing this E really, really clearly, the wedge-tailed eagle. We would have to walk to 4 feet to see the same quality of vision that the bird sees at 20 feet. So just imagine when you've got that hawk circling above you, it really does have its eye on you, right? It knows exactly what you're doing. And for my chickens, for sure, it has its eye on them too. So what about visual acuity makes a bird so amazing? There are some truly phenomenal adaptations that these eyes have done. So a tiny bit more of anatomy. So to create this binocularity, we have to have a really specialized part of our eyeball that really has a high density of sensitivity to light, quality of light sensitivity, and that region is called the fovea in people. It's up towards your ear, so this little blob here is your optic nerve. That's where you're blind. You have a blind spot. You've done those little tests as a kid where you put the spot and you can't see it in one part of the eye. That's your blind spot. But next to it, towards your ear, is a region called the fovea. And most mammals don't have this. We're really special. But raptors have done it twice. So essentially, they have one out towards their ear, but they also have a second one towards their beak. So they really have phenomenal skills. So this is the temporal fovea, present in both species. And what that does is it helps with binocularity up front, right? So we're both capable of seeing binocularly in front of our faces. And that gives that bird on the wing the ability to look at what it's just about to eat, right? It's running, it's flying down, and it's trying to catch the thing in front of it. But at the same time, it's using its central fovea to find the next thing on its side eye, right? The next part of its vision, you know, is the next part of its meal is being mediated by its lateral vision. So just imagine the processing power of this eyeball to not only figure out what's in front of it and how to catch it and eat it, but also planning for the next attack, right? So phenomenal, just amazing. This is a fun research experiment that a group of computer scientists did. This is Toothless, the Harris hawk, that these computer scientists collaborated with by sticking some cameras on its head, that you can see here. And they actually filmed Toothless and one of its friends doing a kind of chase, trying to find something, and then they modeled it using computers. So this is what essentially Toothless sees when he's chasing something. So what you see now is the blue left visual field, the right visual field in red, and then the overlap is the binocular visual field in front of it. But you see the quality of the vision on either side is tremendous. This is slowed down by 5 times. So if you actually then, if I can get it to go, this is how Toothless sees the real world. So like super fast. He is like pitching and yawing and like navigating to chase that thing. So anyway, I thought that was kind of cool to put it into perspective as to how their world really flows. And the one thing I really got away from this presentation was because of the amount of vision that they have, they're flowing through the world in a way that we do not. We face the world and our world comes towards us. They literally swim through the world like a fish. And so really it's like an immersive video game for a bird. So we'll talk very briefly about depth and distance. Again, I could give another 20 more slides on this, but we're going to talk a little bit now about these aquatic birds. Maybe not the aquatic birds, but the birds that have to go from air to water, because that is a challenge. It's why you have to wear swim goggles, right? So if you dive into a pool, your vision is really terrible when you get in there, because you lose the dark side of the moon capability of bending light with your cornea, and we're not adapted to doing that. So what happens is your vision becomes very far-sighted when you, short-sighted, sorry, when you go underwater. So that's why you wear swim goggles, to maintain the air-water interface when you go underwater so that you can still see well. But the Australian darter, which is a fishing species, so this is a Piscivarius bird from Australia that faces a really special challenge. It has to hunt fish underwater. So it doesn't just go and grab a fish from the water. It dives into the water and swims and grabs the fish inside the water. So it has to pivot from air vision. Oh, here we go. Ooh, come back. There we go. It has to pivot from air vision to water vision immediately. And so what it has done inside the eye, because the cornea is irrelevant, right? Can't do anything with that because it's an air-water interface loss, is that it squishes its lens with its iris, and it pushes the lens to make it really fat really quickly. And so you as a human, you can go from long away vision to short away vision, and the number that you can accommodate, you can change that visual focus, is about 10 to 15 diopters. And if you're a photographer, you know what that means. This bird can do 70 to 80 diopters. And it also does it really, really fast because it's also trying to eat something. It's not doing it over a long period of time. So really just phenomenal adaptations that some of these species have done to kind of live in its environment. So the last thing we'll touch on is the field of view that birds have. And again, we'll touch back really quickly on these images. So just to remind you that here's binocularity in purple, but we have these fields of view that each eye has. And when you're a bird or any other prey species, you have a really broad monocular field compared with us. One thing to point out though is birds don't live on the ground for the most part. They live in the air, or at least part of their lives. So Graham Martin, who's done a lot of this work, actually created a different way of looking at this, which is a sphere. So you essentially think of your head as a little pinpoint inside the sphere, and then your visual field surrounds you 360 degrees. So the little triangle here is your nose, which is a little tiny bit of a blind spot in front of your face. And then this green is your binocular field, so you can see above and below your nose. And then your monocular fields are in this kind of orange color, which is one eye, so you can orient your head once you see something that comes into your visual field. And then behind your head is a very large blind spot. And most birds have this similar sort of type 1 type visual field, where you have a varying size of binocularity that kind of surrounds your beak, in this case, not nose. So you see here 2 species of birds, and you have a very large monocular field, so one eye only. And then the blind spot can be variably sized, but also still typically behind the eye and also under the chin. But you can't creep up on a woodcock. Because a woodcock literally has eyes that see behind it. So I really had a hard time with this picture. This is the bill, so this is the front. This is the back. You can still see the eyeballs perfectly. So this bird truly has a mohawk of binocular field that sits above its head. So instead of the beak's down here. So it's blind where its beak is, like in terms of binocularity. It's got some vision, but it's certainly not good quality vision. Its focus, its binocular focus, is above its head in about 190 degrees. And that's because it's a nesting bird on the ground, right? It has to make sure that it's not going to get eaten or disturbed by things coming along. So that's its like 2D version here. This is Graham Martin's work again. So 190 degrees that goes from about sort of bill height all the way around to the back of its head. And it's this tiny sliver of a mohawk that goes all the way above its head. Everything else is a single eye, but there really is almost nothing except underneath its tummy that is a single eye, the blind. Compare that with your average type 1 bird, which we just talked about, the egret. And this has a small binocular field and a blind spot, so very similar to us, but a lot more monocular vision. But then quickly bringing this back to the owls again. So I wanted to end on the owls. The owls have put their eyes very front and facing. So they've also pushed a lot of feathers to the front of their face to optimize optical and auditory processing. So they really have a blind spot under their chin here as well. And their binocular field is kind of above their bill. They can't really use their bill unless they orient their head. So I want you to think about that when you look at this video. It's going to play a few times of an owl perching. So this is an owl that's choosing to come to a handler. It's got a glove that's coming towards, and you see its behavior. You would never think of this until you think of vision. So look at this bird. Look what it's doing as it comes towards the glove. And I will play this a few times, and I will point out it is lifting its legs to put them into its visual field at the same time as dropping its head to put the binocular visual field and the legs together. So that behavior is visual focus. It's trying to get the thing it needs, which is perching behavior, into its visual field in the optimal way. So think about that when you watch birds land. It's amazing. And then I just wanted to end this little anatomy presentation for the poor little kiwi. There's 5 species of kiwi that live in New Zealand, and they de-evolved their eyeballs because they live in an island that has no terrestrial mammals. So it's ground nesting and it's nocturnal. So why do you need eyeballs? You don't need to detect predators, and you can't see anything to forage in the dark anyway. So it essentially has these tiny little pea eyeballs, and then it has nostrils that sit right at the end of its beak, and it has an extremely tactile beak. So there's strong evidence that these birds use mostly sensory information from the olfactory system and from the tactile system to exist. So in the last couple of seconds before Jonathan tells me to run away, I just wanted to sort of share a little story that I learned as I was doing this presentation. So I sit and work in front of a large bay window, and I've had a number of bird window collisions this spring. And it made me sad, and it made me think, gosh, let me research this for this presentation. So the reason that birds collide with windows is the reason that you don't see that curve in the road when you're driving fast on the highway, right? You're not really paying attention to where you're going when you know where you're going, right? Your vision is also, perhaps as a bird, much more focused sideways than frontal, right? We've just talked about how most bird species have a very small binocular field. Are you focusing heavily on where you're going when you're a bird, or are you focusing on flowing through the environment like a fish? So if you think about how birds collide with anything, it's probably because their attention is not focused forward. So Graham Martin proposes that we should be putting out signposts for birds, which is kind of amazing, right? We should be 360 degrees surrounding objects that they might crash into. Kind of infeasible. So one thing that at least I have done, I haven't put it up yet, but because one of my neighbors is in the audience and she'll know, but I have bought this from this company. I don't get sponsored by them at all. I just felt strongly that I should do something. is some kind of visual barrier so that the bird understands. Because if you think about windows, there's such a conceptual element of our world. We understand what they are. Birds have no idea, right? So they're not thinking, oh, I must avoid this window. They're thinking, I got to get to the other side, and then they bounce off of the window. So if you put, and they have to be very specifically spaced, a 5 centimeter spacing of these, whatever you choose to do, dots, little birds, whatever, it's really, really good at reducing the risk of bird-window collisions. And everybody thinks of this in high-rise building contexts. By far, the most window collisions happen in single or dual-story buildings that are residential. So if all of you in this audience went home and bought this stuff, you would reduce the bird-window collisions in your environment substantially. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you want to find my research, I do not research birds, so sadly you would just get to read about your dog for the most part, but if you are interested, my website is there, and yeah, I'm happy to speak to you. All right, question over here.
The brain to process signals from the eye. In a bird like the ostrich, which has a huge eye and a small brain, does the visual cortex occupy a much larger percentage of its prey?
That's a great question. The question was, in an animal that has a large eye and a smaller brain, how is that sort of differentiated? There's actually some evidence that a lot of visual processing in birds actually also happens inside the eye. So the information the brain already gets is kind of pre-processed. So yes, the visual cortex is probably very large in these birds that have large eyes, but not proportionally as large as you might think. Ooh, that's a great question. I genuinely don't know. The question was the fish-eating bat. How does the fish-eating bat find its prey because its vision as a bat is relatively poor? That would be a question for the bat biologists in the room, because I have not researched that subject, but thank you for the very thought-provoking question. Question over here. That is a great question. So the question was, with Kiwis living in Kiwi land and Kiwi humans bringing in apex predators like dogs and rats and mice and various other ones, rats, how can Kiwis survive? I think that is a existential question for the Kiwi, right? They are endangered. They can't evolve fast enough, right? I mean, if evolution of the eye has taken millennia, so if you think about the timeline of creating new ways to adapt, I think we as humans have to provide some support there, right? So yeah, it's a great conservation question. We can't allow the bird to just cope with it. That's not feasible.
Also, if a kiwi, is it considered as
That's a great, the question was, is a kiwi a cannibal if it eats a kiwi? Great joke. I actually Googled kiwi to find that picture that I had of kiwis, and found somebody who had drawn a kiwi, and in cross-section it looked like a kiwi fruit, which I thought was amazing. I have no idea. I don't know why kiwi fruit are called kiwi fruit, actually, so great question. Question at the back.
Do birds live long enough to get cataracts?
That's a good question. Do birds live long enough to get cataracts? Age-related cataracts are not well described in birds, but birds certainly live long enough in theory to get photic cataracts, so UV exposure, enough accumulating over the life to cause cataract. It's probable, though, that those long-lived species have kind of adapted to that and probably have a lot of antioxidants that try to limit the risk of UV damage. What I will say is other things can cause cataracts. So we do see cataracts in birds. The biggest one was already mentioned is West Nile virus, so inflammation inside the eye. So when we see a bird with cataracts, a wild bird with cataracts, our first step is usually to look into the health of the bird. I've definitely seen some captive bird species that have had cataracts, and it can cause problems. And I suspect it's probably somewhat dietary related. Just like you can have songbird ocular syndrome because of diet, I think the diet we feed our captive birds is probably slightly less diverse and optimized for their survival. So we also, though, allow them to live a lot longer in captivity than they do in the wild. So yeah, we definitely do see cataracts, whether they're truly age related or due to other things is hard to say. All right, thank you.